The air in Bozeman carried that soft chill only autumn could bring, the kind that whispered through the pines and brushed the golden leaves lining Main Street. On the evening of October 7th, 2006, Grace Hill Church glowed softly against the dimming sky, its windows fogged from the warmth of laughter and hymns inside. 17-year-old Sarah McMillan stood by the door, smiling as her friends trickled out after youth group. Her auburn hair caught the light of the street lamp, and her voice lingered in the air as she said goodnight. Sarah was the kind of girl who left a mark without trying. She sang in the choir, tutored younger kids, and dreamed of studying psychology at Montana State University. Her father, Pastor John McMillan, often called her his heart in motion. Everyone in Bozeman seemed to know her, or at least know of her, the pastor's daughter with a quiet strength that made people trust her. That night, though, trust was about to fracture in ways no one could imagine. A light rain had begun to fall, the kind that darkened the pavement without soaking it. Sarah waved to her best friend Emily, who shouted from her car window, "Text me when you get home." Sarah nodded, tucking her notebook under her arm and walking toward her old silver Corolla parked near the lot's edge. She never sent that text. When the church lights finally went out around 9:45 p.m., Pastor McMillan locked the door, unaware that his daughter's car still sat by the river bend a mile away, door open, engine off. What began as a quiet night of worship would become the longest evening Bozeman had ever known. The next morning, word spread like wildfire through the valley. The radio interrupted its usual country tunes to report a missing person alert. Volunteers gathered at the church before sunrise, their flashlights cutting through the mist as they called her name across open fields. "Sarah!" The echo came back empty, swallowed by the stillness of the mountains. Detective Mark Reynolds arrived just after dawn, his breath visible in the cold air. A seasoned officer with 20 years in Gallatin County, he'd seen runaways, accidents, even abductions, but something about this case felt different. There was no struggle, no trail, just silence. As the day dragged on, reporters arrived from Helena and Missoula, crowding near the church steps where Pastor McMillan stood, pale and trembling, holding Sarah's photo. His voice broke as he addressed them. "If anyone knows anything, please bring my daughter home." Behind him, the church's cross gleamed faintly through the fog, casting a long shadow across the empty parking lot. That shadow would stretch over the town for years, because when someone like Sarah disappears, the question isn't only who took her, it's what was taken from everyone who loved her. If stories of truth, faith, and justice move you, subscribe now, and follow this powerful journey to its end. The last night Sarah McMillan was seen alive began like so many others, calm, ordinary, and tenderly predictable. The Grace Hill Youth Group gathered every Friday in the fellowship hall, where the scent of hot cocoa mingled with pine from the old wooden beams. Soft guitar music filled the air as 20 teenagers sang hymns, their voices carrying through the church like fragile promises. Sarah stood near the front, notebook in hand, jotting down lyrics she planned to use for Sunday's service. "Hey, you coming to the bonfire tomorrow?" asked Emily, her laughter bubbling over the hum of conversation. Sarah smiled, her eyes bright. "Wouldn't miss it." "I'm bringing my dad's old guitar." Emily nudged her playfully. "You and that thing are inseparable." "It keeps me grounded," Sarah replied, closing her notebook. "Like prayer you can hear." By 9 o'clock, most of the group had dispersed. A few lingered, stacking chairs and cleaning up snack wrappers. The rain had picked up, tapping against the stained glass windows. Pastor McMillan, always the last to leave, was in his office reviewing sermon notes for Sunday. He peeked into the hall and called out, "Sarah, make sure you lock up before you go, sweetheart." "Got it, Dad," she answered, her voice faint but cheerful. She stayed behind a few minutes longer, helping the janitor Ethan Cole mop the entryway. Ethan was quiet, older than the rest, a man in his late 20s who'd been hired by the church after a few rough years. "You don't have to stay," he told her, ringing the mop. "I don't mind," Sarah said. "I like the quiet when everyone's gone." He gave a brief nod, glancing at her with a strange mix of admiration and unease. "You're a good kid," he muttered. At 9:25 p.m., she finally stepped out into the rain, pulling her denim jacket tight. The parking lot glistened under the streetlights, reflections of gold and silver dancing on the puddles. Her car sat near the edge of the lot, close to the narrow road that curved toward the Gallatin River. She unlocked the door, placed her notebook on the passenger seat and paused, looking back toward the church as if she'd forgotten something. A car engine hummed somewhere behind her. She turned, noticing a pair of headlights waiting at the intersection. The rain blurred their shape. For a moment she hesitated, then brushed a strand of wet hair from her face and climbed into her car. That was the last verified moment anyone saw her. By morning, when Pastor McMillan awoke to an empty kitchen table and an untouched cup of coffee, a knot of dread formed in his chest. He tried to convince himself she'd gone for an early drive or stopped by a friend's house, but when he found her bed neatly made, her phone on the nightstand and her jacket missing, denial slipped away. He whispered into the silence, "Sarah," knowing deep down she wouldn't answer. And out there by the river bend, the rain kept falling. By sunrise, Grace Hill Church had turned into a command post. Patrol cars lined the street, radios crackling with clipped voices. Volunteers poured in carrying thermoses of coffee, their faces drawn and sleepless. Pastor McMillan moved among them like a ghost, clutching Sarah's photo, the one from her 17th birthday with frosting on her cheek and laughter frozen in time. Detective Mark Reynolds stepped out of his SUV, adjusting his worn leather jacket. He'd seen missing persons before, but something about this case gnawed at him. "We start from the church," he told his team. "She was last seen here. Every step after that matters." He glanced toward the pastor. "And keep him informed. He's not just family, he's half this town's heart." The search began along the gravel road leading toward the Gallatin River. Muddy footprints disappeared near the water's edge, too smudged to tell if they were hers. Sarah's silver Corolla sat quietly nearby, driver's door ajar, keys still in the ignition. The radio hummed faintly, a gospel station fading in and out. There was no blood, no struggle, only absence, heavy and absolute. Reynolds crouched by the car. "No sign of a fight," he murmured. Officer Turner nodded. "No purse, no phone? It's like she stepped out and vanished." Reynolds exhaled slowly. "People don't just vanish. Something always leaves a trace." Back at the church, volunteers organized search grids across the surrounding woods and fields. Emily, her best friend, stood trembling beside Pastor McMillan. "She wouldn't just leave," she whispered. "She texted me last night, said she'd be home in 10. McMillan's voice cracked. "She's not the kind to run." "Someone took her, Emily." By evening, the local news had already set up cameras near the church steps. Reporters asked questions the pastor couldn't answer. "Do you suspect foul play? Was your daughter having trouble with anyone?" The flash of microphones felt cruel against the rawness of his grief. "Please," he said softly, "let the police do their work. My daughter deserves that." In the days that followed, Bozeman's calm unraveled. Flyers covered grocery store windows and gas pumps. Strangers prayed together in parking lots. Search dogs combed the forests north of town, but found nothing beyond tire tracks that led nowhere. Reynolds called in the county sheriff's department for assistance, but each lead collapsed into silence. One evening, exhausted, he stopped by the McMillans' home. The pastor sat on the porch, eyes red-rimmed. "Detective," he said quietly, "I keep thinking maybe I missed something. Maybe I should have driven her home." Reynolds shook his head. "You can't go down that road. We'll find her. We always find them." But he knew the statistics. After 48 hours, hope thinned like mist over the river. Still, as darkness fell, the detective looked toward the mountains, their peaks shrouded in low clouds. Somewhere out there, he thought, was an answer buried deep in this quiet town's heart, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. As days turned into weeks, the town of Bozeman began to show its cracks. What had once been a place of neighborly trust and Sunday warmth now pulsed with quiet suspicion. The missing posters on cafe windows faded from sun exposure, their edges curling, but Sarah's face refused to disappear from people's minds. Conversations in grocery aisles stopped when Pastor McMillan walked by. Smiles tightened, eyes shifted away. Grace Hill Church, once the heart of community life, stood half empty on Sundays. Some came to pray for Sarah's safe return, others just to watch the pastor's grief unfold. From the pulpit, his voice trembled more with each sermon. "Faith," he said one morning, "is not believing that nothing bad will happen. It's believing that God still walks with us when it does." But even as he spoke, he wondered if he still believed it himself. Detective Reynolds sat in his office at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department, sifting through statements. He rubbed his temples and muttered, "Something's off here." The initial witnesses contradicted each other. One teen said Sarah left alone, another swore she saw her talking to someone in a blue truck. The janitor, Ethan Cole, confirmed he'd been working late that night, but his timeline had gaps, small ones but enough to raise questions. Reynolds met with his partner, Officer Turner. "We're missing something," he said, spreading the reports across his desk. "Every time we get close, the story changes." Turner sighed. "It's a small town, Mark. People talk, then regret it. Half of what we hear's just gossip." Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "And the other half?" "Fear," Turner replied quietly. Meanwhile, rumors seeped into every corner of Bozeman. Some claimed Sarah had been secretly dating an older man. Others whispered about jealousy within the youth group, and a few, more cruelly, suggested the pastor himself knew more than he let on. The whispers spread like wildfire, not shouted, but carried softly from one cautious mouth to another. At the diner on Main Street, Emily overheard two women at the counter. "She was too good for this world," one said, stirring her coffee. "Or maybe not as perfect as everyone thought," the other murmured. Emily slammed her cup down. "You didn't know her. Don't talk like that." The room went silent. She left in tears. Late that night, as frost crept across the parsonage windows, Pastor Macmillan sat alone at Sarah's desk. Her diary lay open, pages filled with neat handwriting and soft pencil sketches. He turned each page slowly until a sentence caught his eye. "There's something I need to tell, but I'm not ready yet. Maybe after youth night." His breath caught. That entry was dated the day before she vanished. He read it again, tracing the words with trembling fingers. "What secret, sweetheart?" he whispered into the stillness. The ticking clock offered no reply, only the cold truth that whatever Sarah had kept hidden now lay buried beneath layers of silence, somewhere between faith and fear, waiting to be unearthed. Winter had settled early that year, frosting Bozeman's rooftops in white silence. 3 months had passed since Sarah's disappearance, and hope, though fragile, still flickered in some corners of town. For Detective Mark Reynolds, it burned like a stubborn ember. He sat in his office one morning when the phone rang, an unfamiliar voice, rough and hesitant. "This is Walter Hayes," the caller said. "You don't know me, but I live out by the old cotton fields, near Route 191. "I think I saw something that night." Reynolds straightened. "Go on, Mr. Hayes." "I didn't think much of it at first. It was raining hard and I was heading home from the mill, but I saw a blue Ford pickup parked by the church around 9:30, engine running, lights off." He paused. "Didn't look right to me." "You get a plate?" Reynolds asked, already jotting notes. "Partial one," Hayes replied. 693 Montana plate. I figured you'd want to know." After the call, Reynolds pulled the case file from his desk drawer. Blue truck. That detail had surfaced before, buried in one of the early interviews, when a teenage witness had mentioned seeing headlights near the church lot. The lead had gone nowhere then, but now it felt like a breath of fresh air. By afternoon, Reynolds and Officer Turner traced the partial plate through DMV records. 3 possible owners. 2 lived miles away in Billings. The third, however, was local. Ethan Cole. The name hit like a stone dropped in still water. Ethan had worked at the church for nearly 2 years. His record showed a minor assault charge from his 20s and a DUI, both dismissed after community service. He'd been cooperative during the first interviews, calm and polite, but now, under new light, his calm felt rehearsed. That evening, Reynolds drove to the church. The building stood quiet, snow dusting the front steps. Ethan was there, repairing a loose railing with gloved hands. "Evening, Detective," he said, eyes cautious but steady. "Ethan," Reynolds began. You still drive that old Ford? Ethan paused, setting his wrench down. Yeah, why? Mind if we take a look at it? He hesitated for a fraction too long. Sure, it's parked out back. The truck was faded blue, mud-caked along the tires, its bed scattered with tools and scrap metal. Reynolds noted the partial plate, a perfect match to Hayes's description. You said you were fixing the heater the night Sarah went missing, Reynolds said. That's right, Ethan answered. Left around 10. Went straight home. Anyone see you? My neighbor, maybe, he said, voice tightening. Detective, I already told all this before. You think I had something to do with that girl's disappearance? Reynolds met his eyes. I think you were here that night. And I think you know more than you're saying. Ethan's jaw clenched. You're wrong. But as Reynolds drove away, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that beneath Ethan's steady voice lay a tremor, the kind born from guilt, not fear. The blue truck became the talk of Bozeman within days. By Monday, rumors flew faster than the winter wind sweeping across Main Street. Some said Ethan Cole had been arrested. Others swore the pastor was covering for him. None of it was true, but in a town that fed on whispers, truth and speculation blurred like frost on glass. Detective Reynolds sat across from Ethan in the small interview room at the county station. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence between them. How you know why you're here? Reynolds began, his tone calm but edged with intent. Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. Because some old farmer thinks every blue truck looks the same? Because you were at that church the night Sarah disappeared, Reynolds replied, and your timeline doesn't fit. Ethan exhaled sharply. I told you I left around 10. You told me you went straight home, Reynolds said, sliding a sheet of paper across the table. Your neighbor says she didn't see your truck until after midnight. Ethan's eyes flickered. She must be mistaken. Maybe, Reynolds said, but maybe not. The tension hung heavy. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan leaned forward. You think I hurt her? I think you know something you're afraid to say. Ethan's jaw clenched. You don't get it, detective. When something bad happens in a town like this, people look for someone to blame. And a guy like me? He gave a bitter laugh. I've been the town's mistake before. Reynolds watched him carefully. There was defiance in his tone, but underneath it, a flicker of pain, maybe truth. Then help me clear your name, Reynolds said quietly. If you're innocent, prove it. When Ethan was released later that afternoon, the damage was already done. Church members avoided him at the grocery store. Parents pulled their children closer when he passed. Pastor McMillan struggled with the weight of it all. At home that night, he sat at the kitchen table, his Bible open but unread. His wife Helen looked at him across the room. They're saying Ethan was the last person to see her, she whispered. I know, he said. Do you believe it? He hesitated. I don't know what to believe anymore. The following Sunday, McMillan stood before his congregation, his voice steady but hollow. We are a people of faith, he told them, but faith is not fear dressed as righteousness. If we condemn without truth, we lose what makes us whole. Yet he could feel it, the silent judgment simmering behind every bowed head. Outside, after service, Reynolds approached him. We're still working leads, he said gently. I need you to keep faith a little longer. McMillan nodded, though his eyes looked distant. Faith's easier to preach than to live. As the detective drove away, snow began to fall again, erasing footprints on the church steps. And somewhere beneath that clean, white quiet, the truth lay buried, waiting for someone to dig through the ice. Time moved differently in Bozeman after Sarah's disappearance. Seasons changed, people aged, but the empty chair at the McMillans' dinner table remained untouched. The first year was filled with searches and vigils. By the second, with silence. Eventually, the case faded from front pages, leaving behind only a few boxes of files and a community that learned to carry its grief quietly. Detective Mark Reynolds stayed on the case long after it went cold. Even after the department reclassified it as unsolved, he refused to box it away in his mind. Each year, he called Pastor McMillan on the anniversary. Still no word, he'd say softly. But I haven't stopped looking. The pastor always answered the same. then neither will I. By 2011, Macmillan had stepped down from Grace Hill Church. The weight of unanswered prayers had become too heavy. He and his wife moved to a small cabin outside Helena, where the air was thinner and the expectations fewer. He found work counseling families of missing persons, people who carried the same unbearable what-if that haunted him. His voice, once full of certainty, had grown quieter, but his empathy deepened. In 2015, Reynolds retired. The file was passed to younger detectives who barely knew Sarah's name. He kept her photo pinned above his desk at home, beside a coffee mug filled with old pens. His wife sometimes found him there at midnight, staring at the case notes spread across the table. "You still chasing ghosts?" she'd whisper. He'd smile faintly. "Not ghosts. Promises." Meanwhile, Bozeman changed. The once sleepy college town expanded with new housing developments and ski tourists. New families moved in, unaware of the shadow that lingered over the old Grace Hill property. The church, still standing, had new leadership and a smaller congregation. To most, Sarah Macmillan was just a name on a memorial plaque near the entrance. But to those who'd lived through 2006, her story was a wound that never fully healed. Every year, on October 7th, Pastor Macmillan returned to Bozeman to light a candle by the river where Sarah's car had been found. Sometimes Emily joined him, now married with children. They'd stand in silence, the wind carrying the faint scent of pine and rain, as if the land itself remembered. In 2020, the world slowed down. The pandemic quieted towns, emptied streets, and forced reflection. For Macmillan, isolation reopened old doors. He began writing letters, not to the police, but to Sarah. "I see you in the light over the mountains," he wrote, "in the kindness of strangers. I still pray for your truth." By 2023, the pain had softened, but the longing had not. Then, one late autumn afternoon, Macmillan received a call from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department. The voice on the line was young, steady, and unfamiliar. "Reverend," the detective said, "we've reopened the Macmillan case. There's something you should know. New forensic evidence just came in." For 17 years, silence had been Bozeman's only answer. Now, at last, it whispered something different, the faint stir of truth rising again from the cold. The call came just after dawn. Pastor John Macmillan was pouring his morning coffee when the phone rang, the sound cutting through the quiet cabin air like a blade. "Reverend Macmillan," a voice said, calm but urgent. "This is Detective Rachel Carter, Gallatin County Cold Case Unit. We've been reviewing your daughter's file. There's something new." Macmillan's heart stalled. "Something new?" he repeated. "After 17 years?" "Yes, sir," Carter said. "We reprocessed several pieces of evidence using advanced DNA techniques, materials that weren't testable in 2006. One of the samples from your daughter's jacket produced a match." He set the mug down slowly. "A match to who?" There was a pause. "I think you'd better come in." The drive from Helena to Bozeman felt longer than it had in years. Snow dusted the fields, the mountains rising pale and still in the distance. Macmillan gripped the steering wheel, memories pressing like ghosts against the glass. Sarah's laughter in the car, her voice singing to the radio, her promise to be home by 10. When he arrived at the sheriff's department, Detective Carter greeted him with quiet respect. She was young, mid-30s maybe, her eyes sharp with empathy and exhaustion. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "I know this isn't easy." "I've waited half my life for answers," he replied. "Easy stopped mattering a long time ago." In the briefing room, she laid out the evidence. "This," she said, pointing to a photo of Sarah's denim jacket, "was preserved in climate control since the initial investigation. We sent it to the state lab for re-examination last month. They isolated a partial male DNA profile from the collar, likely from skin contact." She slid a paper toward him. "That profile matches an individual who submitted DNA for a separate case earlier this year." Macmillan frowned. "Who?" "Thomas Halbrook," Carter said quietly. "He served on the church board in 2006, led community vigils for your daughter." The room seemed to tilt. Macmillan's breath caught, disbelief twisting into something raw. "That can't be right. Tom, he baptized Sarah. His voice broke. He prayed with us. I know, Carter said softly, but the match is strong. 99.8%. We've confirmed his identity through CODIS. Silence filled the space. Macmillan stared at the report, the letters blurring. He remembered Tom's steady hand on his shoulder after every sermon, his reassuring words when hope faltered. The betrayal felt biblical, a serpent hiding among saints. Carter continued, "We're not jumping to conclusions, but the DNA places him in close contact with your daughter the night she disappeared. We're reopening the full investigation. You should prepare yourself, and this will shake the community." Macmillan looked up slowly, his voice hoarse. Bozeman has been asleep for 17 years. Maybe it's time it woke up. As he stepped back into the cold Montana air, snowflakes brushed his coat like ashes. The town he once knew, the one built on faith and trust, was about to learn that the truth, when it finally comes, doesn't whisper. It roars. When John Macmillan drove back into Bozeman for the first time in nearly a decade, the town felt both familiar and foreign. The streets had changed, new cafes, more traffic, but the mountains stood the same, solemn and unblinking. Snow lay soft on the rooftops, and somewhere beneath that stillness, the truth he'd waited 17 years for had begun to stir. Detective Rachel Carter met him at the edge of town. "Thank you for coming," she said as they shook hands. Her grip was firm but warm. "We're interviewing Thomas Halbrook tomorrow morning. We wanted you to know before it becomes public." Macmillan nodded, his voice low. "It already feels public. The minute you said his name, it spread through my mind like wildfire." He checked into a modest motel near the university, one he and Sarah had once passed during summer fairs. That night, he walked the familiar streets alone. He stopped in front of Grace Hill Church, its steeple rising pale against the stars, and felt a hollow ache in his chest. Through the frosted windows, he could see people inside, their voices rising in quiet prayer. But the faces were different now. The congregation had changed, yet the air still held that same fragile reverence. Word of the reopened case had already reached the community. At the diner, old conversations revived with fresh venom. "Halbrook," someone whispered over coffee. "No way. The man's a saint." Another voice murmured, "They said they found his DNA. You can't argue with science." "Science gets it wrong plenty," a third replied. "Maybe it's a setup. Maybe the pastor's just looking for someone to blame." Macmillan sat 2 booths away, listening to every word. He said nothing, only stirred his tea and stared at the steam curling upward like the prayers that once filled his church. Later that evening, he visited Detective Mark Reynolds. The old detective, grayer now but still sharp-eyed, opened his door with surprise. "John," he said softly, "didn't think I'd see you here again." "I didn't either," Macmillan admitted, "but they found something." "DNA." Reynolds gestured for him to sit. "Yeah, I heard. Carter's good. Better resources now. Back then we were chasing shadows." He paused, searching Macmillan's face. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure," Macmillan replied. "Part of me feels relief, the other part feels fear. What if the truth is worse than not knowing?" Reynolds nodded slowly. "It usually is. But it's also the only way to breathe again." When Macmillan left the house, the night had deepened. The air bit with cold, the kind that carried memory. He looked toward the distant hills, where the river curved beneath sheets of ice. Somewhere near that water, his daughter's story had ended, and now it seemed was beginning again. The next morning, as sunlight spilled over the snow-dusted fields, Macmillan whispered a quiet prayer. Let the truth come clean, even if it burns. He didn't yet know how much it would. Thomas Halbrook arrived at the sheriff's department just after 9. Snow clung to his boots as he stepped through the door, his breath misting in the cold morning air. He looked older than John Macmillan remembered, thinner, slower, his once proud posture bent beneath invisible weight. Yet his eyes, calm and measured, still carried the confidence of a man used to being respected. Detective Rachel Carter greeted him politely. "Mr. Halbrook, thank you for coming in." He smiled faintly. "Of course. I've got nothing to hide. Please have a seat." she said, gesturing toward the table. She opened a folder and slid a photo across to him, Sarah's jacket. "You recognize this?" Halbrook's expression softened. "Of course. That poor girl. I led prayer circles for her every week after she disappeared." Carter nodded. "We're grateful for that." "But the state lab found something new on this jacket. A DNA sample. It matches you." The room fell silent. Halbrook blinked, the faintest twitch breaking his composure. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "The results are confirmed," Carter replied. "Would you like to explain how your DNA ended up on Sarah McMillan's clothing?" He looked down at his hands. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "I hugged her that night after youth meeting. She was upset about something, said she'd had an argument with her father. I told her she could always talk to me. Maybe that's where it came from." Carter's tone stayed level. "We tested several areas. The DNA wasn't only on the collar. It was also found under the jacket's right sleeve, in a spot consistent with forceful contact." Halbrook swallowed hard. "I don't know what to tell you." Through the glass window, John McMillan watched from the adjoining observation room, his heart pounding. Every word scraped against years of grief. He whispered to Reynolds beside him, "He's lying." Reynolds kept his gaze steady. "Let her keep pushing." Carter leaned forward. "Mr. Halbrook, you were one of the last people to see Sarah alive. You've been her pastor's closest friend. This isn't going away. If something happened, even an accident, now is the time to say it." Halbrook's hands began to shake. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he murmured. Carter's eyes narrowed. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" He looked up, tears gathering. "She came to me after the meeting. She was crying, said she'd made someone angry. I tried to comfort her, but she pulled away. I grabbed her arm. Too hard, I guess. She fell, hit her head. I panicked." His voice cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just didn't know what to do." McMillan's knees weakened. Reynolds caught his arm before he stumbled. Inside the room, Halbrook covered his face. "I carried her to the truck," he whispered. "Drove to the river. I thought she might wake up, but she didn't. I was terrified. I prayed. God help me. I prayed. And then I left her there." The confession hung in the air like smoke, heavy, undeniable, and suffocating. When the news broke, Bozeman stopped breathing. The local paper ran the headline, "Former Church Elder Confesses in McMillan Cold Case." For hours, the town sat in stunned silence. Teachers paused classes, store radios replayed the sheriff's press statement, and people in line at the coffee shop whispered in disbelief. The name Thomas Halbrook echoed across Montana like a betrayal no one wanted to claim. At Grace Hill Church, the sanctuary felt colder than ever. Members gathered in uneasy clusters, their prayers replaced by questions. Some wept quietly, others refused to believe it. "Tom wouldn't hurt anyone," said Mary Cavanaugh, clutching her Bible as though it might erase what she'd heard. "He built this church with his own hands." But no one could ignore the evidence, nor the confession. Detective Rachel Carter stood before the press, calm despite the flashing lights. "This case reminds us that justice may sleep, but it never dies," she said. "Mr. Halbrook is cooperating. Formal charges are pending." Her words rippled through the crowd like wind over snow. For many, they were the sound of long-awaited closure. For others, they were the sound of faith shattering. That night, John McMillan sat alone in his motel room, staring at the wall. The confession replayed in his head like a broken record. She fell. I panicked. He wanted to hate Halbrook, to curse the years stolen from his daughter's memory. But beneath the rage lay exhaustion, deep and bone-heavy. His wife Helen called from Helena. "You got what you wanted," she said softly. "Do you feel any lighter?" He hesitated. "No," he whispered. "Just hollow." Reynolds visited later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," he said. "You stayed long enough to see the truth." McMillan shook his head. "Truth isn't what I thought it'd be. It doesn't heal. It just exposes the wound." Reynolds took a sip, his eyes tired. "Maybe. but it's the only thing that keeps the rot from spreading. Across town, Hal Brooks sat in a cell, hands folded, eyes unfocused. Reporters had swarmed his home, his family gone into hiding. He asked for a Bible and spent hours reading the Psalms aloud, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Create in me a clean heart, O God," he murmured, "and renew a right spirit within me." But even Scripture couldn't wash away what he'd done. As days passed, Bozeman fractured into disbelief and outrage. Some saw Hal Brooks' confession as proof of divine justice, others as proof that evil had worn a trusted face for far too long. Attendance at Grace Hill plummeted. The church that once stood for unity had become a symbol of silence and shame. Yet amid the chaos, a quiet understanding began to grow. Truth had finally pierced through the years of fog. And though it burned, it also illuminated the path forward. Standing at his motel window, Macmillan watched the town lights flicker beneath the dark Montana sky. For the first time in 17 years, he knew what had happened. But knowing, he realized, was only the beginning of reckoning. The thaw came early that spring, and with it, a revelation no one expected. While combing the banks of the Gallatin River near the old bridge, investigators found a shallow grave marked by time and mercy, a place where earth and water had conspired to keep a secret for 17 long years. Wrapped carefully in remnants of a denim jacket and wool blanket, the remains were confirmed to be those of Sarah Macmillan. The call came to John Macmillan on a clear March morning. "We found her," Detective Rachel Carter said gently. He sat in silence for a long time before whispering, "Thank you." It was a strange relief, like breathing after nearly drowning, only to find the air sharp and cold. Bozeman gathered again, just as it had all those years ago. But this time it wasn't for a search or a vigil. It was for a farewell. The service was held in the same church where Sarah had once sung, her voice filling the rafters with joy. The pews overflowed with faces old and new, some who had prayed for her, others who had judged her father in his grief. Pastor Macmillan stood before the congregation, holding a small folded piece of paper. He took a deep breath, his hand steady though his voice trembled. 17 years ago, he began, my daughter walked out of this church believing the world was good, and for a long time I thought that belief had died with her. But I see now, it's still alive, in the people who never stopped looking, who never stopped hoping. He paused, looking out at the sea of bowed heads. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's refusing to let hate finish what tragedy began. Emily sat in the front row, tears streaming silently. After the service, she approached him, placing a small box in his hand. I kept these, she said softly. Inside were photos, friendship bracelets, and a folded note that read, For Emily, and someday we'll see the ocean. Macmillan smiled faintly. She always dreamed too big for Montana, he said, voice cracking with both pride and sorrow. Outside, the sky was cloudless, the mountains etched in sharp relief against the sun. People lingered near the steps, some talking in hushed voices, others simply standing in silence. Even those who had doubted the pastor years before offered quiet condolences. Bozeman, at last, seemed ready to heal. Later that evening, Macmillan returned to the riverbank. The air was crisp, the water slow and dark. He knelt, brushing his hand against the damp soil where his daughter had lain hidden. You're home now, he whispered. The waiting's over. For a moment he felt something shift, not in the air but inside him. The endless ache that had filled his chest for 17 years softened, leaving space for something gentler, peace. And though the current continued its eternal song, carrying memory downriver, John Macmillan finally understood that closure wasn't an ending. It was the quiet permission to begin again. The months following Sarah's burial unfolded quietly. Bozeman seemed to move slower, as though the entire town were exhaling after years of holding its breath. Yet beneath that stillness lingered the ache of unfinished reckonings. Justice, though served, had left behind the question of forgiveness. Thomas Hal Brooks' trial was swift. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, accepting a 20-year sentence with no chance of parole. The courtroom had been tense that day, the hum of reporters, the quiet sobs from his family, and John Macmillan sitting in the front row, hands clasped tightly in prayer. When the judge read the sentence, Macmillan felt neither joy nor anger, only a weary kind of understanding. Weeks later, a letter arrived at his cabin. The envelope bore no return address, only his name written in neat, trembling handwriting. Inside, on lined paper, were the words, "I don't ask you to forgive me. I only ask that you pray for what's left of my soul. I see her face every night. I see yours too. I wish I could go back, but all I can do now is kneel and confess. I am sorry, Reverend. I am sorry for everything." Macmillan read it twice before folding it neatly and placing it inside his Bible. That night, he couldn't sleep. Forgiveness had always been a sermon, a virtue he'd taught others to hold fast to. Now, faced with the man who'd taken his daughter, it had become a test of his own faith. A month later, he visited the state penitentiary. The guards led him through long corridors until he reached the chapel, where Halbrook sat alone at a wooden pew. When he turned and saw Macmillan, his face crumpled with shock. "You came," he whispered. "I didn't come for you," Macmillan replied softly. "I came for her." Halbrook lowered his head. "I have no excuse." "There's nothing you could say that would change what happened," Macmillan said. "But I believe forgiveness isn't for the one who asks. It's for the one who needs peace to keep living." Halbrook's eyes brimmed with tears. "Can you ever forgive me?" Macmillan took a long breath. "Not today, but maybe someday. I'll try." They sat in silence, two broken men bound by tragedy, until a guard's voice ended the moment. As Macmillan left, he looked back once and saw Halbrook kneeling in prayer, hands trembling, whispering words that only God would hear. Outside the prison gates, the sky stretched wide and clean. Macmillan felt a strange lightness, fragile but real, the first flicker of grace returning. In the weeks that followed, he began working again with families of victims, helping them navigate the labyrinth of loss. Detective Rachel Carter invited him to speak at a seminar on perseverance in unresolved cases. His words were simple. Justice can close a case, but only forgiveness can close a wound. Sarah's story had ended, but its echo had become something greater, a testament that even in the darkest grief, light could still find its way through the cracks. By the summer of 2031, Bozeman had transformed. The once quiet college town now buzzed with tourists, hikers, and new families drawn to the valley's endless skies. Yet beneath its growth, echoes of the past remained, faint but enduring, like an old hymn carried by the wind. Grace Hill Church stood rebuilt, its fresh white siding gleaming in the sun. Where sorrow once lingered, laughter had returned. Children played in the courtyard, their voices rising where prayers of grief had once filled the air. John Macmillan, now in his late 60s, walked slowly up the steps each Sunday. He was no longer the church's pastor, but his presence drew quiet reverence. In his hand, he carried a worn leather book titled The River We Must Cross, his own memoir, a blend of reflection, faith, and the long road through grief. The book had been published the previous year and had unexpectedly found an audience far beyond Montana. Readers wrote from across the country, thanking him for reminding them that loss could be lived with, not defeated. After service one morning, a young woman approached him. She couldn't have been older than Sarah was when she disappeared. "Reverend Macmillan," she said softly, "your daughter's story changed my life. My brother went missing 2 years ago. Your book helped my mom keep believing." Her eyes glistened. "I just wanted to say thank you." Macmillan smiled gently. "Sarah would have liked you," he said. "She always believed kindness could ripple farther than we imagine." He walked outside afterward, breathing in the clean scent of pine. The distant peaks of the Bridger Range shimmered in the light, ancient and unbroken. Emily, now a teacher and mother of 2, joined him by the steps. "Can you believe it's been 25 years?" she asked. He chuckled softly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes like another life." "She'd be proud of what you've done," Emily said. "I hope she'd see that I finally learned what she tried to teach me," he replied. "That faith isn't about never breaking. It's about mending stronger. At the river's edge later that afternoon, Macmillan paused near the memorial stone bearing Sarah's name. Wildflowers had sprung up around it, purple lupine and yellow balsam roots swaying in the breeze. He placed a single white lily beside the stone. "The world's still turning, sweetheart," he murmured, "and I'm still learning how to live in it." In the town library, a scholarship fund now bore Sarah's name, supporting local students pursuing psychology, the dream she never got to chase. Photos of her smile hung above the plaque, a quiet reminder that tragedy hadn't erased her, only transformed the way she remained. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Macmillan watched the horizon with a sense of peace that once seemed impossible. Bozeman had grown, healed, and carried on, but it had not forgotten, and neither had he. The morning was cool and bright when John Macmillan returned once more to the river. The Gallatin flowed gently, clear as glass, carrying the memory of everything it had witnessed. Birds traced slow circles above the valley, and the air smelled faintly of pine and thawed earth. He stood by the water's edge, cane in hand, gazing at the spot where decades ago his world had fractured. It was quiet now, not the heavy silence of grief, but the peaceful kind that follows forgiveness. Macmillan felt the years on his shoulders, but he also felt their weight lifting. The past no longer chained him. It had shaped him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a page from Sarah's old notebook, the one that had survived in a box of her things. The words, faded but legible, read, "One day we'll all cross the river, but maybe what matters is what we learn before we do." He smiled softly, the ache in his chest tempered by pride. "You were right, sweetheart," he whispered. "You always were." Behind him, footsteps approached. Detective Rachel Carter, now a captain, walked up quietly. "You still come here every spring?" she asked. He nodded. "It's where I remember who I am." She smiled. "Your story helped a lot of people, Reverend. Not just here, everywhere. You should know that." Macmillan's eyes glimmered. If pain can be turned into something that helps others heal, then maybe that's redemption. They stood together for a while, watching the current bend and twist toward the horizon. Carter finally said, "We never stop chasing justice, but some cases, they end up chasing us instead." Macmillan chuckled softly. "Then I guess I was caught. And freed." As she left, he lingered by the water, listening to the rush of the river. Time had taken so much, his daughter, his ministry, his old certainty. Yet it had given him something deeper, the wisdom to understand that love doesn't end with loss, it only changes form. He closed his eyes and let the wind move through his hair, carrying his whispered prayer downstream. "Thank you for every moment, even the ones that broke me, because they taught me how to rise." The church bells from Bozeman rang faintly in the distance, marking noon. He turned toward the sound, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle in his chest. For the first time, the future didn't feel empty. It felt open. As he walked back toward town, he thought of the people who had stood beside him, Reynolds, Carter, Emily, and the strangers who had found hope in his words. Sarah's story was no longer just tragedy. It had become testimony, proof that truth, no matter how long it hides, will always find its way to light. If this story moved you, if faith, truth, and resilience mean something to you, subscribe now to join more journeys of real courage and redemption. And before you go, click the video on your screen to continue exploring the stories that remind us why hope is always worth holding on to.